The world swam into focus, a blur of muted colors sharpening into the familiar drabness of a small apartment. Emily's breath caught as her eyes fixed on the wall calendar. March 15th, 1980. The bold red characters, printed on cheap paper, stared back at her, unyielding. Her trembling hands clutched the edge of the worn wooden table, its surface sticky with years of spilled tea and neglect. She was alive. Again. The sharp, bone-crushing pain from her final moments lingered like a ghost in her limbs. She could still feel the cold marble of the staircase beneath her, the warm blood pooling around her head, the searing betrayal as David Parker, her husband of 20 years, stood at the top with his adoptive sister Rachel in his arms. Their faces had faded into darkness as Emily's life slipped away, her last breath a silent scream of rage and sorrow. But now, impossibly, she was back. Reborn in the spring of 1980, in the cramped apartment she'd once called home, in a China stirring from decades of austerity. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and frying dough from the street vendors outside, a reminder of Beijing's bustling hutongs, where life pulsed despite the gray uniformity of Mao-era buildings. Emily's heart pounded as memories of her past life flooded in. She had been a dutiful wife, married to David, a rising factory director whose polished smile charmed their factory town. For 20 years, she'd believed his excuses, his distance, his refusal to touch her, his claim of a medical condition. She'd blamed herself, her rural upbringing, and her lack of education in a society that prized women's obedience over ambition. But on their 20th anniversary, the truth had shattered her. She'd come home early from a spa, a gift from Rachel, only to find David and Rachel tangled together, their pale bodies mocking her marriage. Rachel's cold sneer had cut deeper than the sight itself. "David only stayed with you out of pity," she'd spat, her eyes glinting with triumph. "You drugged his soup to trap him. Your pregnancy? I slipped abortion pills into your food. Your happiness was nothing." David, silent, hadn't denied it. Emily's world had collapsed. She'd grabbed him, demanding answers, her voice raw with fury. In the chaos, she'd stumbled, tumbling down the stairs. Her head had struck the floor, and as blood gushed, she'd seen them. David cradling Rachel, their faces indifferent to her dying. Now, reborn, Emily's fingers tightened on the table, her knuckles white. The apartment was just as she remembered. Peeling paint, a single bulb flickering above, a stack of ration coupons on the counter, a relic of China's planned economy, soon to give way to Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Outside, bicycles clanked and vendors hawked steamed buns, signs of a nation on the cusp of change. Emily's chest heaved with a mix of fear and resolve. She was no longer the naive girl who'd married David, believing love could overcome his coldness. This time, she saw the truth. Her marriage was a facade covering for David and Rachel's forbidden love. She'd been a pawn, her devotion exploited to shield their secret. Her gaze fell to her hands, calloused from years of sewing, a skill passed down by her grandmother, a master of Sioux embroidery. In the 1980s, as China opened its markets, fashion was blooming, bright silks and intricate patterns replacing the blue-gray work uniforms of the past. Once dismissed as outdated, Emily's craft held new promise in this awakening world. But so did her pain. The memory of Rachel's sabotage, her lost child, her stolen years, burned like coal in her chest. She thought of David's gentle public persona, his private cruelty, and Rachel's manipulative heart condition, a lie she'd wielded to keep David close. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She wouldn't be their victim again. Footsteps echoed outside the door, pulling her from her thoughts. The lock clicked, and David's warm and familiar voice filled the room. "Emily, something smells amazing." He stepped in, his factory jacket slung over one arm, Rachel trailing behind, her delicate frame wrapped in a scarf despite the mild spring air. They laughed with ease, a stark contrast to Emily's turmoil. Rachel sank onto the sofa, tossing her bag aside. "Soup again, Emily?" she asked, her tone laced with mockery. Emily forced a faint smile, her voice steady despite the storm within. "No, it must be the neighbors cooking." She stood smoothing her apron, her eyes flicking to the health supplements on the table. Gifts from David, supposedly for her pregnancy preparations. In her past life, she'd believed his care was genuine. Now she knew they were for Rachel, a pretense to mask his true devotion. The realization stung, but it also sharpened her purpose. As David set down his bags, chatting about the factory's new export deal, a sign of China's economic shift, Emily's mind raced. She was back at the start, before the soup, before the pregnancy, before the betrayal that killed her. This was her chance to rewrite her story, unravel David and Rachel's lies, and reclaim her worth in a society that expected her to bow. The 1980s were a time of opportunity, where a woman with skill and grit could rise, even against the weight of tradition. Emily's trembling hands steadied. She would not waste this rebirth. With every stitch, every step, she would tear down their facade and build a life of her own, one where no one could break her again. The apartment hummed with the clatter of chopsticks and the low drone of a radio broadcasting news of China's latest trade deals. Emily stood at the stove, stirring a pot of cabbage and pork, the steam curling around her face like a veil. The familiar routine, cooking for David and Rachel, tidying their modest home, felt like a charade now, each motion a reminder of her past life's blindness. In 1980, Beijing's streets buzzed with bicycles and the promise of reform. But inside these walls, Emily was trapped in a lie she was only beginning to unravel. David sat at the table, his factory director's badge glinting under the dim bulb, recounting a meeting about exporting textiles to Hong Kong. Rachel, lounging on the sofa, flicked through a fashion magazine, her delicate fingers tracing images of silk dresses, a luxury emerging in China's opening markets. Their ease, their shared glances, cut Emily deeper than she'd expected. In her past life, she'd seen these moments as sibling affection, a bond forged by years of dependence. Now, reborn with the truth, she saw the undercurrent, a love that mocked her marriage. Emily's mind drifted to the early days of their marriage, a year ago in this timeline. She'd been 20, a rural girl with no dowry, married to David, the town's golden son. Society expected her to be grateful, to serve her husband and bear children, and to have her worth tied to family, not dreams. David's charm had dazzled her, but his touch never followed. He'd claimed exhaustion or a vague medical issue, leaving Emily to blush at neighbors' questions about babies. She'd internalized the shame, believing her plainness or lack of sophistication drove him away. The memory tightened her grip on the ladle. The truth had come on their 20th anniversary, when she'd caught David and Rachel together. Their betrayal laid bare. Rachel's confession, that she'd slipped abortion pills into Emily's food and that David married Emily out of pity, had shattered her. But one memory burned brightest now: the chicken soup. Their neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, had given Emily tonic supplements, swearing they'd help David's health. Desperate to conceive, Emily had stirred them into soup, and that night, David, flushed and unsteady, had finally touched her. She'd gotten pregnant, only for Rachel to sabotage it, her heart condition flaring as an excuse to cling to David. Emily's miscarriage had been no accident, and her marriage was a cover for their forbidden bond. Now, as David praised the aroma of her cooking, "Emily, you've outdone yourself." Emily's stomach churned. The table was littered with health supplements, jars of royal jelly and ginseng, their labels promising vitality. In her past life, she'd believed they were for her, a gesture toward the child they'd never had. But Rachel's pale hand reached for a jar, and David's quick nod confirmed the truth. They were for her, always her. Emily's voice was calm, masking her fury. "These are for pregnancy prep, aren't they?" she asked, her eyes flicking between them. Rachel's face drained of color, her magazine slipping to the floor. David's smile faltered, but he recovered, taking the jar from Emily's hand. "For Rachel's health," he said stiffly. "She's been weak lately. We're young, Emily, no rush for a baby." His lie was smooth and practiced, a reminder of the factory town's reverence for him, a man who easily navigated the new market economy, his reputation untouchable. But Emily saw through it now. The way Rachel's gaze lingered on him, possessive, not sisterly. She turned to the stove, her back to them, the soup's rich scent mingling with the coal smoke drifting through the open window. Outside, vendors called out, selling bright scarves and plastic trinkets, signs of a China shedding its gray uniformity. Emily's heart raced. In her past life, she'd have nodded, accepted David's excuse, and served the soup with a smile, desperate to please. She'd been the ideal wife, her grandmother's Sioux embroidery skills relegated to mending clothes, her ambitions stifled by a society that saw women's value in domesticity. Not anymore. The pot simmered its contents, a symbol of her past manipulation, the tonic-laced soup that had briefly broken David's restraint, only to bind her to years of pain. Emily's eyes narrowed. She lifted the pot, its weight heavy in her hands, and walked to the sink. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tilted it, watching the broth swirl down the drain, the herbs catching briefly before disappearing. The act was silent, but it roared with defiance. She wouldn't play their game again. David's voice cut through the quiet. "Emily, what are you doing?" He stood, his brow furrowed, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Rachel sat up, her scarf slipping to reveal a flush on her cheeks. Emily turned, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression serene. "It wasn't ready," she said. "I'll make something else." Her calm was a weapon, a refusal to bend to their expectations. As she chopped green onions, the knife's rhythm steadying her, Emily's mind sharpened. The 1980s were a time of flux, state factories privatizing, women stepping into markets, and their kipows and perms defying old norms. Emily's grandmother had taught her to stitch phoenixes into silk, a craft now prized as China embraced beauty again. She could be more than a wife, more than a pawn. David and Rachel thought she was ignorant. A rural girl they could control. But she saw their secret now, and her resolve grew with every glance they shared. Rachel's voice broke her thoughts, sharp and petulant. "Emily, hurry up, I'm starving." David chuckled, the sound grating. Emily set the table, her movements mechanical, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the design competition at Century School as a chance to showcase her embroidery in Beijing's burgeoning fashion scene. David would try to stop her, citing Rachel's needs, but Emily was done bowing to their lies. This was her second chance, and she'd unravel their facade, stitch by stitch, until the world saw them for what they were, and her for what she could become. The morning sunlight filtered through the apartment's thin curtains, casting a golden haze over the living room. Emily stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched at Beijing's hutongs come alive. Bicycles clinked past vendors, hawking steamed buns and bright polyester scarves, symbols of a China awakening to Deng Xiaoping's reforms. In 1980, the city pulsed with possibility. State factories turning private, women trading work uniforms for qipaos. But inside, Emily felt the weight of her marriage, a cage she was determined to escape. She turned from the window, her eyes falling on a small wooden box beneath the table. Inside were her grandmother's embroidery tools, needles, silk threads, and a half-finished peony pattern, its vibrant reds faded from years of neglect. Her grandmother, a master of Sioux embroidery, had once stitched for wealthy families in Jiangsu, her phoenixes and lotuses adorning bridal gowns. But the Cultural Revolution had shuttered her shop, deeming such crafts bourgeois. Emily taught and clung to those skills as a child, though her marriage to David had reduced them to mending his shirts. Now, reborn, she saw her craft as a lifeline. David's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Emily, where's my tie?" He stood by the door, adjusting his factory jacket, his director's badge catching the light. Sipping tea on the sofa, Rachel glanced up from a magazine, her scarf loose despite the warm spring air. Emily's jaw tightened. Last night, she'd poured out the tonic-laced soup, her first rebellion against their facade. David's unease had been palpable, but he'd said nothing, his control still firm. Rachel's mocking smile had lingered, a reminder of her power over him. "It's in the drawer," Emily replied, her tone even. As David rummaged, she slipped the wooden box into a cloth bag, her heart racing. 6 months ago, Principal Jack Wu from Century School had seen her embroidered qipao on a neighbor and invited her to teach embroidery classes. David had refused, his words sharp. "You're busy enough. Rachel's health comes first. You didn't even finish high school. Don't make a fool of yourself." His dismissal, rooted in the era's expectation that women prioritize family, had crushed her then. But now, with the truth of his betrayal burning in her chest, Emily wouldn't let him stop her. She waited until David left for the factory, and Rachel retreated to her room, claiming a headache, a frequent excuse Emily now suspected was exaggerated. Slipping on a simple cotton dress, she pedaled her bicycle through the bustling streets, the air thick with coal smoke and the chatter of market vendors. The reforms transformed Beijing. Shops displayed colorful fabrics, and young women sported perms and lipstick, defying old norms. Emily's pulse quickened. Once obsolete, her grandmother's craft was prized in this new China, where beauty was no longer a crime. Century School stood at the district's edge, its courtyard alive with students practicing calligraphy and weaving. Principal Wu, a wiry man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. "Emily, I hoped you'd reconsider," he said, leading her to a classroom where bolts of silk and cotton lined the walls. "Your embroidery could inspire our students. We're entering a traditional clothing design competition in Beijing, a qipao to showcase our heritage. Will you join us?" Emily's fingers traced a spool of gold thread, her grandmother's lessons echoing. Each stitch is a story, a piece of you. The competition was a chance to prove her worth to David and to a society that saw her as a rural wife, valuable only for domesticity. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Wu beamed, outlining the plan. She'd teach weekly classes and design a qipao for the contest, blending Sioux embroidery's floral intricacy with modern flair. The prize could elevate the school and Emily to national recognition. As they selected rich reds and deep blues fabrics, Emily felt a spark she hadn't known since childhood, when she'd sat at her grandmother's knee, learning to weave phoenixes. But doubt crept in. David would resist, and Rachel, sensing a threat, would tighten her grip. In her past life, Emily had believed Rachel's heart condition justified her neediness, only to learn it was a manipulation, confirmed by neighbors' whispers of her theatrics. The memory of Rachel's sabotage, abortion pills in her food, steeled Emily's resolve. She wouldn't let them dim her light again. She returned home as the sun dipped low, the apartment quiet save for the radio's faint hum. David was back, reading a factory report while Rachel napped. Emily set her bag down, the wooden box hidden inside. "Where were you?" David asked, his tone casual but edged. Emily met his gaze, her heart steady. While visiting Mrs. Wilson, she lies, naming their neighbor. She needed help with sewing. David nodded, but his eyes narrowed, sensing a shift. Rachel stirred, her voice sharp. "Sewing? Don't you have enough to do here?" Emily smiled faintly, deflecting and just helping out. She moved to the kitchen, her mind alight with plans. The competition was her path to independence, a way to reclaim her identity in a China where women were beginning to carve their own spaces. David's control and Rachel's jealousy were obstacles, but Emily was no longer the naive bride who'd bowed to them. As she chopped vegetables, the knife's rhythm quiet defiance, Emily envisioned her qipao, a cascade of peonies, their petals threaded with gold, a testament to her skill and resilience. The 1980s were a time of reinvention, and she would reinvent herself, not as David's wife or Rachel's servant, but as Emily, heir to her grandmother's legacy. The seeds of her independence were sown, and though the path ahead promised conflict, she was ready to fight for her place in this changing world. The apartment was stifling, the air heavy with the scent of boiled rice and the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from Beijing's bustling hutongs. Emily stood in the storage room, her grandmother's embroidery tools spread across a rickety table. A bolt of crimson silk, bought with savings she'd hidden from David, shimmered under the dim bulb. She traced the fabric, envisioning her qipao for the Century School competition, a cascade of peonies stitched in gold, a defiance of the drab 1980s uniforms that once defined her world. Outside, vendors hawked colorful scarves, a sign of China's economic boom, but tension simmered like the pot she'd left on the stove inside. Emily's visit to Principal Wu had ignited a spark. Teaching embroidery and entering the Beijing design competition were her first steps toward independence, a rebellion against the era's expectation that women like her, rural, uneducated, exist only to serve husbands and families. But David's disapproval loomed. He'd forbidden her from working, citing Rachel's health, a lie Emily now saw through. In her past life, she'd believed Rachel's heart condition justified her clinginess, only to learn it was exaggerated, a manipulation to keep David close. Neighbors' gossip, overheard at the market, confirmed it. Rachel's dramatic fainting spells conveniently flared when attention strayed. The door creaked, and Rachel's voice cut through the quiet. "Emily, where's my tea?" She stood in the doorway, her scarf loose, her eyes sharp with suspicion. David was at the factory, leaving the apartment to the two women, their uneasy truce fraying. Emily set down her needle, her pulse quickening. "On the counter," she said, keeping her tone neutral. Rachel's gaze flicked to the silk, her lips pursing. "What's that?" "New fabric?" Her voice dripped with accusation, as if Emily's ambition threatened her hold over David. Emily straightened, meeting Rachel's stare. "For a project," she said, refusing to elaborate. Rachel stepped closer, her delicate frame belying the venom in her eyes. "A project? With what money? David's?" Her words echoed the societal norm that a wife's resources belong to her husband, a norm Emily was beginning to reject. Emily's jaw tightened. "My grandmother's savings," she replied, her voice steady. The lie was small but deliberate. She wouldn't give Rachel the satisfaction of control. Rachel's face twisted, her cheeks flushing. "Savings? Or did you seduce David for it?" The accusation stung, a reminder of Emily's past life when she'd tried perfumes and low-cut dresses to win David's affection, only to face his scorn. Rachel's jealousy, once hidden behind sisterly smiles, now spilled over. "You think you're clever sneaking around, don't you?" she spat, snatching the silk from the table. "You don't deserve this." Emily's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Put it down, Rachel." Her voice was low, a warning. The silk, bought with her dreams, was more than fabric. It was her future, a chance to rise in China, where women were starting to own shops and factories. Rachel's eyes blazed, and with a sneer, she threw the silk to the floor, stomping on it with her slippered foot. The delicate fabric crumpled, dirt from the floor smearing its sheen. "You'll never be more than a servant here," Rachel shouted, her voice shrill. Fury surged through Emily, white-hot and unfamiliar. She'd have apologized, cleaned the mess, and begged for peace in her past life, cowed by Rachel's tantrums and David's authority. But not now. The memory of Rachel's betrayal, slipping abortion pills into her food, robbing her of her child, flashed in her mind. With a cry, Emily lunged, shoving Rachel back. The force sent Rachel stumbling against the wall, her scarf falling to reveal a flush of anger, not an illness. "Please don't touch my work," Emily yelled, her voice raw. Rachel clutched her chest, her breath hitching dramatically, but her eyes betrayed no pain, only rage. "You pushed me," she gasped, sliding to the floor, her performance polished. Emily froze, her hands trembling as she bent to retrieve the silk, its edges smudged but salvageable. The door slammed open, and David's voice boomed. "What's going on?" He stood in the doorway, his factory jacket unbuttoned, his face darkening as he saw Rachel on the floor clutching her chest. "She attacked me," Rachel sobbed, her voice breaking. David rushed to her side, his arm around her, his eyes cold as they turned to Emily. "Is this true?" he demanded. Emily clutched the silk, her heart racing. In her past life, she'd have crumbled under his gaze, accepting blame to keep the peace. But the truth, Rachel's manipulation, David's complicity, burned too brightly now. "She ruined my fabric," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear. "I defended myself." David's jaw tightened, his hand lingering on Rachel's shoulder. "Rachel's sick, Emily. You know that." But his tone faltered, and Emily saw a flicker of doubt. Neighbors had whispered about Rachel's theatrics, and Emily's defiance was planting seeds of suspicion. Rachel's sobs grew louder, but Emily didn't flinch. "If she's so sick, why does she have the strength to destroy my work?" she asked, holding up the soiled silk. The question hung in the air, challenging David's unquestioning loyalty. David helped Rachel to the sofa, his movements stiff. "We'll talk later," he muttered, avoiding Emily's gaze. Rachel's eyes, red but dry, glared at Emily, promising retribution. Emily turned to the storage room, clutching the silk like a lifeline. The clash exposed Rachel's insecurity and fear of losing David to Emily's growing independence. In 1980s China, where women were expected to prioritize family over self, Emily's ambition was a threat, a spark that could ignite her freedom or burn her down. As she smoothed the silk, her fingers tracing the faint stains, Emily's resolve hardened. The competition, her embroidery, and her grandmother's legacy were her path out of this cage. Rachel's jealousy and David's control were obstacles, but she was no longer the naive wife who'd bowed to them. The hutongs outside thrummed with change, and Emily would change too, stitching her future with every defiant thread. The storage room was a dim sanctuary, its single bulb casting long shadows across the cluttered table where Emily's crimson silk lay, its edges smudged from Rachel's attack. The apartment beyond was silent, and the earlier clash with Rachel left brittle tension. Emily's fingers trembled as she threaded a needle, her embroidery a fragile anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Outside, Beijing's hutongs buzzed with evening life, vendors calling, bicycles clinking, a reminder of 1980s China, where economic reforms promised change. But for women like Emily, freedom remained elusive. The confrontation with Rachel had exposed the fault lines in their household. Emily's pursuit of the century school competition and her refusal to bow to Rachel's jealousy challenged the status quo. In her past life, she'd believed David's gentle facade, his public charm as a factory director masking his private indifference. She'd excused his distance, blaming herself in a society that valued women's obedience over agency. But Rachel's sabotage, abortion pills that stole her child, and David's complicity had shattered that illusion. Now, reborn, Emily saw him clearly, and her defiance was a spark he wouldn't tolerate. Footsteps broke the quiet, heavy, and deliberate. The door creaked open, and David's silhouette filled the frame, his factory jacket unbuttoned, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Emily's heart lurched, but she kept her eyes on her needle, stitching a peony's petal with forced calm. "Rachel says you pushed her," he said, his voice low, a blade wrapped in silk. "She's in pain, Emily. Her pinky's broken." The lie was blatant. Rachel's theatrics, confirmed by neighbors' whispers, were a tool to bind David to her. Emily set down her needle, meeting his gaze. "She ruined my fabric," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I defended myself." The crimson silk lay between them, symbolizing her ambition in China, where women were beginning to sell qipaos and open shops. Defying old norms, David's eyes flicked to it, his lip curling. "Your fabric?" he sneered. "Do you think that matters when Rachel's hurt? You know she's sick." The mention of Rachel's supposed heart condition, now exposed as exaggerated, stoked Emily's anger. "If she's so fragile, why does she have the strength to attack me?" She shot back, holding up the soiled silk. David's face darkened, his control slipping. Emily would have apologized in her past life, cowed by his authority and the era's expectation that wives endure silently. But the memory of her death, falling down the stairs, David's arms around Rachel as she bled, burned too fiercely now. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the light. "He said you don't get to question her," his voice chilling. "Rachel's my sister. She can do what she wants. If she hits you, you take it." His words echoed the patriarchal norms of 1980s China, where men like David, bolstered by status, wielded unchecked power at home. Emily's breath caught, her hands clenching. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice rising. "I'm your wife, David. Does that mean nothing?" His hand shot out, seizing her wrist like an iron vice. Emily gasped, the pain sharp, but she didn't pull away. "You're here to serve us," he snarled, his eyes cold, devoid of the warmth he showed the world. "You pushed her, Emily. Rachel's pinky is broken, and you owe her an arm." Before she could react, he grabbed a steel pipe from the corner, a tool left from fixing a leak, and raised it high. Time slowed, the glint of metal searing into her mind. The pipe came down with a sickening crack, striking her left arm. Pain exploded, a white-hot wave that tore a scream from her throat, raw and soul-deep. Emily crumpled to the floor, clutching her arm, the bone shattered beneath her skin. The silk slipped from the table, pooling beside her like blood. David stood over her, unblinking, the pipe clanging as he dropped it. "Let that be a lesson," he spat. "Don't ever upset Rachel again." He turned and walked out, leaving her gasping in the dark. Emily's vision blurred, tears mixing with sweat as she crawled across the floor, each movement agony. The apartment's silence mocked her, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Beijing's markets thriving, its women stepping into new roles while she lay broken. In her past life, David's cruelty had been subtle: neglect, lies, the final push down the stairs. Now his violence was laid bare, a stark reminder of the power men held in a society slow to protect women. Her arm throbbed, but her resolve burned brighter. She wouldn't let this break her. Gritting her teeth, she dragged herself to the door, her good hand fumbling for the knob. Ms. Wilson, the neighbor, answered her weak knock, her eyes widening at Emily's state. "My God, what happened?" she gasped, helping Emily inside. As Mrs. Wilson's son fetched a bicycle to rush her to the hospital, Emily whispered, "David, he did this." The words were a vow, a line drawn. The hospital's cold lights and antiseptic smell awaited, but so did her future. The competition, her embroidery, and her grandmother's legacy were still hers to claim. In the flickering glow of the hutongs, Emily's pain became fuel. David thought he'd silenced her, but only sharpened her purpose. She'd stitch her wounds into strength, unravel his facade, and rise in a China where women like her could finally shine. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on Emily's pale face as she sat on a narrow cot, her left arm throbbing in a makeshift sling. The doctor, a stern woman with graying hair, had set the broken bone, warning that it would take months to heal. Emily's eyes stung, not from the pain, but from the memory of David's steel pipe crashing down, his cold voice declaring her worth less than Rachel's whims. Outside, Beijing's hutongs thrummed with 1980s vitality, vendors selling silk scarves, bicycles weaving through markets. But inside, Emily felt trapped in a world that shielded men like David. Mrs. Wilson's son had rushed her here on his bicycle, the night air sharp against her skin. As the doctor worked, Emily had whispered her story: David's rage, the pipe, Rachel's provocation. Mrs. Wilson, hovering nearby, had gasped, her indignation a flicker of hope. "She urged you to report this," her voice fierce despite the era's unspoken rule that family matters stayed private. In the 1980s, China's Deng Xiaoping reforms opened markets. But women like Emily, rural, bound to domestic roles, faced a society that was slow to challenge male authority. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let David's cruelty silence her. The next morning, her arm aching beneath a fresh cast, Emily pedaled to the local police station, the crimson silk for her chapeau competition tucked in her bag, a reminder of her dreams. The station was a squat building, its walls plastered with posters about grain quotas and family planning. Inside, officers sipped tea, their desks piled with papers. Emily approached a young officer, his badge glinting, and recounted the assault. Rachel's attack on her fabric, David's brutal response, the pipe shattering her arm. Her voice trembled but held firm, each word a defiance of the shame she'd once felt. The officer's face remained impassive, his pen scratching slowly. "A family dispute?" he asked, glancing at her cast. "Husbands and wives argue. Did you provoke him?" Emily's stomach twisted. In her past life, she'd endured David's neglect, believing it her duty as a wife in a society that prized harmony over justice. Now, reborn, she saw the bias. "He broke my arm with a pipe," she said, her eyes blazing. "That's not an argument. It's a crime." The officer sighed, jotting a note, but his tone was dismissive. "We'll talk to him." Hours later, David arrived, his factory director's jacket pristine, his smile polished. "Officers, I'm so sorry for the trouble," he said, his voice smooth as silk. He spun a tale of a heated argument, claiming Emily had fallen during a scuffle, the pipe an accident. His eyes met hers, feigning concern. "Emily, I never meant to hurt you. Let's not burden the police. They're busy enough." His words were a performance, leveraging his status in a town that revered him as a model of China's new economic elite. The senior officer, a stout man with a cigarette dangling, nodded sympathetically. "Director Parker, we know your reputation." These things happen in marriage. Turning to Emily, he softened his tone. "Calling the police over a fight, talking about divorce, it's a bit much. Go home, work it out." Emily's fists clenched, her cast heavy. Like the culture, the law favored men, especially those with influence. In 1980s China, domestic violence was often dismissed as private. and women were expected to endure for the sake of family honor. David's hand grazed her shoulder, a mockery of care. "Let's get you back to the hospital," he said, his smile tight. Emily jerked away, her voice low. "Please don't touch me." The officers exchanged glances, one muttering about stubborn wives. Outside, David's facade dropped, his voice cold. "This was a warning, Emily. Stop making a scene. Rachel's waiting at home." He walked off, leaving her alone on the dusty street, the weight of his power crushing. Emily's chest heaved, fury and helplessness warring within. She thought of her grandmother, whose Sioux embroidery had once adorned elite homes, only to be shuttered by revolutionary zeal. Like her, Emily was fighting a system that devalued her. But the hutongs around her buzzed with change. Women opening stalls, selling chapaos in vibrant hues. She could fight too. Clutching her bag, she pedaled to the hospital, where Principal Wu visited, his face falling at her cast. "The competition," he began, but Emily cut him off. "I'll find a way," she said, her voice fierce. The doctor confirmed she'd need 3 months before the cast came off, ruling out stitching for the Beijing contest. Despair clawed at her, but Emily's mind turned to the wedding gown she'd made before her marriage. A labor of love David had scorned as tacky. Its intricate phoenixes could be her entry, a symbol of her rebirth. Back at the apartment, Rachel's smug voice greeted her. "Back already? I thought you'd run off." David, stirring tea, said nothing, his silence a warning. Emily ignored them, her eyes on the storage room. The gown, her skills, her will, they were hers, unbroken by David's violence or society's bias. She'd also remake herself in a china remaking itself, turning pain into power, one stitch at a time. The apartment kitchen was a haze of steam, the scent of bone broth mingling with the faint coal smoke drifting through the open window. Emily stood over the stove, her left arm heavy in its cast, stirring a pot with her good hand. The pain from David's assault pulsed, but it fueled her resolve. Outside, Beijing's hutongs thrummed with 1980s vigor, vendors hawking silk chipaos, bicycles weaving through markets. A world remaking itself, just as Emily was. In 1980s China, where community gossip could ruin reputations, she held a weapon sharper than David's steel pipe. The truth. Her attempt to seek justice had failed, crushed by the police's dismissal and David's polished lies. As a factory director, he wielded influence in a society that revered men of status, while women like Emily, rural, bound to domestic roles, were expected to endure silently. The memory of his cold warning, "Stop making a scene," burned alongside Rachel's smug taunts. But Emily's past life had taught her their secret. David and Rachel's forbidden love, hidden behind her marriage. Now, reborn, she'd turn their lie into their downfall. Emily's plan was simple but ruthless. She reached for a paper pouch in the cupboard, Mrs. Wilson's tonic, the same she'd once used to spike David's soup, sparking the night that led to her pregnancy and Rachel's sabotage. The tonic heightened desire, a fact Emily now wielded with precision. She poured the entire packet into the broth, the herbs dissolving into the simmering liquid. In her past life, she'd been naive, believing the soup was a path to love. Today, it was bait. David's laughter rang out from the living room, mingling with Rachel's playful retort. "You're hopeless, David." She teased their ease, mocking Emily's pain. Emily's lips curved into a cold smile. She ladled the broth into bowls and set them on the table deliberately. "Dinner's ready?" she called, her voice sweet, masking the storm within. David and Rachel settled in, oblivious, their spoons dipping into the steaming liquid. Rachel took a hearty sip, her cheeks flushing. David followed, his eyes lingering on her, unaware of the trap closing around them. Emily excused herself, claiming a hospital errand, and slipped into the stairwell. She knocked on Mrs. Wilson's door, tears welling on cue. "I need to apologize to David and Rachel," she said, her voice breaking. "I pushed her, and he hurt me. I want peace in front of witnesses." Mrs. Wilson's eyes blazed with indignation. "She hit you first, and he broke your arm." "Are you apologizing?" Emily wiped her eyes, playing the role of the repentant wife. "I'm scared, Auntie. If Rachel hits me again, I won't fight back." Please come with me. Mrs. Wilson, a pillar of the Hutong's gossip network, didn't hesitate. She rallied 3 neighbors, older women whose sharp tongues shaped community opinion in an era where reputation was everything. Let's settle this, one said, grabbing her shawl. Emily led them back, her heart pounding. In 1980s China, public shaming could destroy, especially for a man like David, whose factory role depended on moral standing. The tonic would loosen their restraint, and the neighbors would see what Emily had endured for years. She opened the apartment door, and the living room was a chaos of scattered clothes. The bedroom door stood ajar, and from within came unmistakable sounds, gasps, murmurs, the creak of the bed. "David, go easy," Rachel's voice purred, followed by a low moan. The aunties froze, their eyes wide, faces shifting from confusion to horror. Emily staggered back, her hand covering her mouth, tears spilling for effect. "David, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice breaking. The neighbors stormed to the bedroom, and Mrs. Wilson was at the fore. Rachel's scream pierced the air as she saw them, her face twisting in terror. David caught mid-act and leaped up, scrambling for a blanket. The aunties' gasps turned to shouts. "Disgusting! Incest!" one cried, her voice echoing the era's harsh judgment of moral deviance. Another sneered. "No wonder she never married. She's been with her brother." Rachel clutched the blanket, shrieking, "We're not blood-related." But the damage was done. David's face flushed crimson, and his director's poise shattered. "Emily, how dare you bring people here?" he roared, wrapping a sheet around himself. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, her voice cutting. "You're the disgrace, Director Parker, sleeping with your sister under your wife's nose." The wedding photo on the wall, Emily and David, smiling stiffly, mocked the scene. The aunties' outrage swelled their words, a chorus of condemnation in a community where gossip spread like wildfire. Emily sank to the floor, sobbing convincingly, her cast a silent testament to David's cruelty. "No wonder he hit me," she whispered, loud enough for all to hear. "He never touched me in a year of marriage." The aunties' eyes softened with pity, their anger turning to David. "Poor girl," one muttered, "trapped with a monster." In 1980s China, where family honor was paramount, their verdict was a death knell for David's reputation. As the neighbors retreated, cursing David, Emily rose, wiping her tears. Rachel's panicked sobs faded, David's shouts trailing off. The scandal would spread through the Hutongs, ruining them. Emily's plan had worked, not with violence, but with the community's judgment, a force more potent than any pipe. Her arm ached, but her spirit soared. She'd turned their lie against them, and in this changing China, where women were claiming their voices, she'd claim hers too. The morning sun pierced the apartment's thin curtains, bathing the living room in a harsh light that exposed its cracks, peeling paint, a chipped table, and the faded wedding photo of Emily and David. Emily stood by the window, her left arm heavy in its cast, watching Beijing's Hutongs pulse with 1980s life. Vendors hawked vibrant qipaos, their voices mingling with the clink of bicycles, a testament to China's economic awakening. Inside, the air was thick with the aftermath of last night's scandal, when neighbors had caught David and Rachel in their illicit embrace, shattering their facade. Emily's heart thrummed with a quiet triumph, but the fight ended. The neighbors' outrage had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community, where gossip was currency in 1980s China. By dawn, whispers of incest and disgrace echoed in the market, tarnishing David's reputation as a factory director. Rachel had fled to her room, her sobs audible through the thin walls, while David sat at the table, his face haggard, his polished charm gone. Emily's plan, lacing the broth with tonic, luring the aunties to witness, had worked. In a society that prized family honor, shame was her weapon. But freedom required one final step: divorce. Emily turned from the window, her eyes meeting David's. He rose, his voice low, pleading. "Emily, it was a mistake. I was drunk and thought she was you. Let's move past this." His lie was desperate, a shadow of the man who'd broken her arm with a steel pipe, claiming she owed Rachel. Emily might have wavered in her past life, cowed by his authority and the era's expectation that wives forgive. But the memory of her death, falling downstairs, David cradling Rachel as she bled, steeled her. "No, David," she said, her voice steady. "Your lies end here." Rachel emerged, her face pale, her scarf askew. "You set us up!" she spat, her eyes bloodshot. "You'll regret this, Emily. David loves me, not you." Her defiance, once a blade, now seemed hollow. Her heart condition, a manipulation exposed by neighbors' skepticism, no longer a shield. Emily's lips curved into a cold smirk. "Love? You can have him, Rachel. But I'm done being your cover." She held up her cast. A silent accusation. Rachel flinched, but David's hand on her shoulder silenced her. Emily pulled a folder from her bag, medical records, and an X-ray of her shattered arm, evidence of David's violence. "I'm filing for divorce," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "Sign, or I will send these to your factory's regional director, along with a report of your relationship with Rachel." David's face drained of color. In 1980s China, where moral scandals could derail careers, especially in state-run factories transitioning to private markets, her threat was a guillotine. The neighbor's testimony would seal his fate. David's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Rachel and then to Emily. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice wavered. Emily stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "You broke my arm to protect her. You used me for 20 years in my past life, hiding your shame. Try me, David." The mention of her past life was a slip, but it didn't matter. Her certainty was a blade. Rachel's sob broke the silence, but Emily ignored her focus on David's crumbling resolve. He sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "What do you want?" he muttered. Emily's answer was swift. "The family house on the factory lot." Nothing else. The house, modest now, was prime land in a city poised for property booms as China's economy surged. In her past life, she'd been left with nothing, a rural girl manipulated for David's gain. Now she'd secure her future. David hesitated, then nodded, his pen scratching the divorce papers with a defeated scrawl. Rachel lunged forward, her voice shrill. "You're nothing without him. You'll beg to come back." Emily turned, her smirk widening. "Enjoy your love, Rachel. Let's see how it holds without his title." She tucked the papers away, her heart pounding with victory. The house was hers, a foothold in a China where women were starting to own businesses, defying norms that tied their worth to marriage. David's career was in tatters, Rachel's arrogance exposed, and Emily was free. As she stepped into the storage room, the crimson silk for her Qipao competition caught the light, its smudged edges a reminder of Rachel's attack. Emily's fingers brushed it, her cast a dull ache. In 1980s China, divorce was rare and stigmatized. But Emily felt no shame, only power. The neighbors' whispers, once a cage, now heralded her as the wronged wife, their pity a shield. She thought of her grandmother, whose Sioux embroidery had been silenced by the revolution. Like her, Emily would rise, her craft and will unbroken. David's voice, muted, called from the living room, arranging to move Rachel out. Emily ignored it, her mind on the future. The competition, her teaching, the house, they were hers, earned through pain and cunning. She'd remake herself in a city remaking itself too. No longer David's pawn, but a woman carving her path. The hutongs outside sang of possibility, and Emily's heart answered, ready to claim her place in this new world. The apartment was quiet, its emptiness a stark contrast to the chaos of days past. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced over the bare table, now free of David's papers and Rachel's magazines. Emily stood alone, her left arm in its cast, the divorce papers tucked safely in a drawer alongside the deed to the family house. Beijing's hutongs buzzed outside, vendors calling, bicycles clinking, a vibrant echo of 1980s China, where economic reforms were weaving new dreams into the fabric of daily life. For Emily, freedom was hers, but the scars of 20 years of betrayal lingered, demanding a different kind of healing. She moved to the storage room, where her grandmother's embroidery tools lay on a worn table. The crimson silk for the Century School competition, smudged from Rachel's attack, rested beside a wooden box containing her wedding gown, a labor of love stitched before her marriage to David. Despite years of neglect, Emily's fingers brushed the gown's folded edges, its silk soft. She'd poured her heart into it in her past life, hoping to prove her worth to David, only for him to sneer, calling it tacky. Now, reborn, she saw it not as a relic of shame, but as a testament to her resilience. Emily lifted the gown, its phoenixes and peonies shimmering in gold-threaded Sioux embroidery, a craft her grandmother had mastered in Jiangsu before the Cultural Revolution shuttered her shop. In 1980s China, as fashion bloomed with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, such artistry was prized again. Qipaos and cheongsams gracing markets once dominated by gray work uniforms. Emily's craft, once dismissed, held power in this new era, where women were opening stalls and defying norms that tied their value to marriage. However, for Emily, the gown was more than art. It was a path to mend her soul. She sat, her good hand threading a needle, the cast a dull ache. The silence allowed memories to surface. David's cold rejection, Rachel's sabotage of her pregnancy, and the steel pipe shattering her arm. In her past life, Emily had buried her pain, believing her role as a wife meant enduring. Now, tears welled, not for them, but for the girl she'd been, naive, desperate for love, blind to her worth. She let them fall, each stitch a release, weaving her grief into the gown's intricate patterns. The phoenix, rising from ashes, mirrored her rebirth. Stitching was meditative. Each thread loops a step toward forgiveness, not for David or Rachel, but for herself. She'd blamed her rural roots, her lack of education, in a society that expected women to be silent pillars of family. But her grandmother had taught her otherwise. Each stitch is a story, a piece of you. Emily's story was one of survival, her needles carving a narrative of strength. The gown, once meant for David, became a gift to herself, its beauty a defiance of the shame he'd heaped upon her. Hours passed, the hutong's evening clamor, children laughing, vendors packing up, fading into a soft hum. Emily's fingers worked, gold thread catching the bulb's glow, transforming pain into art. She considered the women in the markets, their perms, and bright scarves a quiet revolution against old norms. Like them, Emily was reclaiming her place, her craft a bridge to a future where she defined her value. The gown's peonies, symbols of honor, bloomed under her needle, each petal a vow to never let anyone dim her light again. A knock startled her. Mrs. Wilson stood at the door, her eyes kind. She said, "You're alone now," offering a basket of steamed buns. "The neighbors are talking. David and Rachel are pariahs." "You did right, child." Emily smiled faintly, accepting the buns. In 1980s China, community judgment was fierce, and the auntie's support, once a cage, now bolstered her. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Wilson glanced at the gown, gasping. "That's stunning, Emily. For the competition?" Emily nodded, her heart lifting. Delayed by her injury, the Beijing design competition was still within reach. Principal Wu had suggested submitting the gown, but its craftsmanship was a contender despite her cast. "It's more than that," she said softly. "It's me." Mrs. Wilson's eyes softened, understanding the weight of her words. In a society quick to judge a divorced woman, Emily's art was her shield, her worth undeniable. As Mrs. Wilson left, Emily returned to the gown, her stitches precise despite the ache in her arm. The phoenixes soared, their wings a promise of renewal. She thought of her grandmother, whose shop had closed but whose spirit lived in every thread. Emily's healing wasn't complete. Nights would still bring nightmares of David's cruelty. But this moment, this creation, was a cornerstone. In China, she embraces beauty and ambition, stitching not just a gown, but a new self that no betrayal could break. The Beijing auditorium hummed with anticipation, its high ceilings adorned with red banners celebrating China's cultural heritage. Emily stood backstage, her left arm still in its cast, her heart pounding as the crowd's murmurs filled the air. The 1980s were a time of reinvention, with Deng Xiaoping's reforms sparking a renewed love for traditional crafts like Sioux embroidery. Tonight, the Century School's entry in the National Design Competition, a wedding gown Emily had stitched before her marriage to David, would take the stage, a testament to her resilience in a society awakening to new possibilities. The gown, resplendent with phoenixes and peonies woven in gold thread, lay draped over a mannequin, its silk catching the stage lights. Emily had poured 3 months into it as a young bride, hoping to prove her worth to David, only for him to scorn it as tacky. In her past life, she'd worn Rachel's choice, a stiff red suit, on her wedding day, her dreams buried. Now, reborn, Emily had reclaimed the gown, its intricate Sioux embroidery a symbol of her rebirth. Principal Wu, who'd submitted it after her injury delayed her qipao project, stood beside her, his eyes bright. "This is your moment, Emily," he said. The auditorium buzzed with designers, officials, and fashion enthusiasts, their chatter reflecting China's shift from gray work uniforms to vibrant qipaos and cheongsams. In 1980s Beijing, where markets brimmed with silk and women donned perms, traditional crafts were no longer relics, but emblems of a nation embracing its past and future. Emily's gown, blending Sioux embroidery's floral intricacy with modern elegance, was a bridge between eras. Yet for her, it was personal, a reclamation of the love and labor David had dismissed. Her thoughts drifted to the past weeks. The divorce freed her from David and Rachel, but their scandal still rippled through the hutongs. The family house, now hers, was a foothold in a city poised for property booms. But healing had come through stitching the gown, each thread a step toward forgiving her naive self, who'd believed her worth lay in David's approval. In a society that often judged women by marriage, Emily's craft was her defiance. She cast a badge of survival after David's violence. The MC's voice cut through her reverie, announcing the next entry. A model stepped onto the stage, the gown shimmering as she moved. The phoenixes soared across the bodice, their wings threaded with gold, while peonies cascaded down the trailing xia, a ribbon-like garment glowing like sunset clouds. The audience gasped, then erupted in applause, thundering through the hall. Emily's breath caught, tears welling. Not for David, but for the young bride who'd stitched her heart into every seam, desperate to be seen. She'd made the gown with no thought of prestige, only love. As a rural girl with no dowry or education, she'd wanted to wear something beautiful to show David she wasn't worthless. His rejection had crushed her, but now, the gown's brilliance under the lights was her vindication. The judges, seated in the front row, scribbled notes, their nods signaling approval. Principal Wu squeezed her shoulder. "They're captivated, Emily. This is Sioux embroidery at its finest." The model paused, the gown's gold threads catching every eye. Emily remembered nights spent stitching by lamplight, her fingers bleeding, her heart full of hope. In 1980s China, where women were opening shops and challenging norms, her gown was a statement. A woman's art could outshine betrayal. The applause swelled, and Emily stepped forward, invited to the stage. Her simple cotton dress and cast contrasted with the gown's splendor, but her presence commanded respect. The MC handed her a microphone, the crowd quieting. "This gown," Emily said, her voice steady, "is for my grandmother, who taught me to stitch stories into silk. Despite the world's weight, it's for every woman who dares to create." The audience roared their cheers, a validation not just of her craft, but of her journey. In a society quick to dismiss a divorced woman, Emily stood tall, her worth undeniable. Tears streamed down her face, a release of pain and pride. Backstage, Principal Wu embraced her. "You've won their hearts, Emily. The judge's decision comes tomorrow, but this is already yours." Emily nodded, her eyes on the gown as the model returned. The phoenixes seemed to dance, a mirror of her rise from ashes. The competition had been her goal, delayed by David's cruelty, but this moment transcended it. She'd stitched her soul into the gown, and Beijing had seen her, not as David's wife, but as Emily, an artist reborn. The city's lights glittered as she left the auditorium, reflecting a China in flux. The hutongs buzzed with vendors and dreamers, and Emily felt part of their tide. Her caste would come off, her house would grow in value, and her craft would carry her forward. In a world remaking itself, she was remaking herself too, her triumph a beacon for every woman daring to rise. The South China sun cast a warm glow over the bustling streets of Guangzhou, where Emily's new office overlooked a market vibrant with 1980s energy. Stalls brimmed with silk qipaos and plastic trinkets, vendors' calls mingling with the clatter of bicycles, a testament to China's economic boom under Deng Xiaoping's reforms. 2 years had passed since Emily's triumph at the Beijing design competition, where her phoenix-embroidered wedding gown had won accolades. cementing her as a rising star. Now, at 23, she stood as the founder of Melon Fashions, a thriving embroidery business, her caste long gone, her spirit unbroken. Emily leaned against her desk, reviewing sketches for a new Cheongsam line, her fingers tracing the peony patterns that echoed her grandmother's Sioux embroidery. The family house, secured in her divorce from David, had been sold for a fortune as Guangzhou's property market soared, funding her venture. In the 1980s, women opened factories and shops in China, defying norms that defined their worth to marriage and motherhood. Yet society whispered that a single woman was incomplete, no matter how successful. Emily ignored the murmurs. Her confidence was radiant and her life was hers. Her journey hadn't been easy. After David's violence, breaking her arm with a steel pipe, and Rachel's betrayal, Emily had channeled her pain into her gown, healing through creation. The competition's applause had validated her talent, but the quiet night stitching, forgiving her naive self, had rebuilt her soul. Now, her office walls displayed awards and photos of models in her designs, each a testament to her rise in a nation embracing beauty and ambition. The Hutong's chatter no longer defined her. She described herself. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Principal Wu, visiting from Beijing, entered with a smile. "Emily, your latest collection is stunning," he said, gesturing to a framed article about Melon Fashions. "But I've brought someone you should meet." He'd been persistent about introducing her to a suitor, reflecting the era's belief that a woman's life needed a husband to be whole. Though content alone, Emily had resisted. She agreed to meet Shen Shi, a university professor, if only to humor Wu, who'd championed her talent. Before they could discuss further, Emily stepped out to the market for tea, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and grilled skewers. As she waited at a stall, a figure emerged from the crowd. David, his once sharp features dulled, his suit ill-fitting, gray streaking his hair at 35. The sight jolted her, memories of his cruelty and Rachel's taunts flashing. He forced a smile, his voice soft. "Emily, how have you been?" She straightened, her tone polite but firm. "Well, David. And you?" Her success, her office, designs, and independence spoke louder than words. He hesitated, muttering, "I've been... okay?" His eyes, once cold, held regret, but Emily felt no pity. In her past life, she'd died believing his lies, a pawn in his and Rachel's forbidden love. Now she was free, her arm healed, her heart whole. David stepped closer, his voice low. "I had a dream, Emily. We were married for 20 years, had children, and grew old. It could have been real." Heavy with longing, his words sought forgiveness, but they rang hollow. Emily lifted her arm, which he'd shattered, her gaze unflinching. "Your apology means nothing, David. I don't need it." Her voice was calm, a blade forged in pain. She'd survived his violence, Rachel's sabotage, and a society that dismissed her. His regret was his burden, not hers. A car pulled up, and Shen Shi, a tall man with a gentle demeanor, called, "Emily, ready?" We had arranged a dinner, and Shen's warm smile contrasted David's shadow. Emily nodded to David, courteous but final. "My friend's waiting. Goodbye." She turned her steps light, leaving David in the market's din. Shrouded in regret, his face faded as she joined Shen, the city's pulse matching her own. At dinner, Shen, a classical Chinese professor, spoke eloquently of poetry and art, his easygoing nature disarming. The evening was pleasant, but Emily's mind was elsewhere. Her new factory in the Northwest, a project to support local weavers, awaited. "I'm moving there next week," she told Shen, smiling. "It's a big step." He chuckled, unfazed. "Then I'll visit." "You owe me a meal of the best local noodles." His respect for her ambition, rare in a society pushing women toward marriage, warmed her. But romance wasn't her path. The night air smelled of blooming osmanthus as they parted, petals drifting like tiny stars. Emily caught one, her eyes bright. "Keep in touch, Professor Shen," she said, meaning it. Her life was complete. Melon Fashions, her craft, her mission to uplift others. In 1980s China, where women were rewriting their stories, Emily's was one of strength, not defined by a man, but by her boundless will. David's shadow was gone, and ahead lay a horizon she'd forged herself. The Guangzhou office of Melon Fashions glowed under the late afternoon sun, its windows reflecting the bustling market below, where vendors sold silk cheongsams and plastic toys in the vibrant chaos of 1980s China. Emily sat at her desk, signing a contract with the local community center to teach Sioux embroidery to young women, passing on her grandmother's craft. 3 years after her divorce from David, her life was a testament to Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Markets booming, women opening businesses, and Emily, at 24, a celebrated entrepreneur. The family house, sold for a fortune, had fueled her empire, but her true wealth was her independence. The radio crackled, interrupting her thoughts with a news segment. In a tragic incident, former factory director David Parker killed his sister Rachel and her lover before taking his own life at an abandoned warehouse. Emily's pen paused, her breath catching. The report detailed David's downfall. Betrayed by Rachel, who'd conspired with his business partner to frame him for fraud, he'd lost everything. In a final act of despair, he'd pushed them from the rooftop and jumped. A witness described David sitting alone, staring into the night before the end. Emily's heart stirred, not with pity, but with closure. She leaned back, the weight of her past lifting. In her past life, David's betrayal, his affair with Rachel, the abortion pills, her death on the stairs, had defined her. Reborn, she'd dismantled their facade, exposing their scandal to the Hutong's judgment. The steel pipe that shattered her arm and the police's dismissal had only sharpened her resolve. David and Rachel were gone, their love a poison that consumed them. Emily's victory was not in their deaths, but in her own life, built stitch by stitch in a China embracing new horizons. A courier arrived, delivering a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph. Her and David, taken at their marriage registration. Her braided pigtails shy, his face stiff. The embossed stamp marked it as torn from their certificate. Emily's lips curved faintly. She pulled the photo into pieces, dropping them into the trash. The past was ash, her future silk. In 1980s China, where women defied norms to lead factories and markets, Emily needed no man's shadow to shine. Her thoughts turned to her embroidery classes. The community center, a hub for women seeking skills in a changing economy, was her way of giving back. She envisioned girls like her younger self, rural, dismissed, learning to weave phoenixes, their needles carving paths to independence. Her grandmother's Sioux embroidery, once silenced by revolution, now thrived in a nation hungry for beauty. Emily's designs graced Beijing runways, but teaching was her legacy, empowering others as she'd empowered herself. The market outside pulsed with life, vendors haggling, young women in bright cheapows laughing, their perms bouncing. Emily smiled, remembering Shen Shi's kind offer to visit her Northwest factory. She hadn't pursued romance, her focus on Melon Fashions and her students. But his letters, filled with poetry, were a gentle reminder of connection. In a society that pressed women to marry, Emily's choice to remain single was her defiance, her life complete in its purpose. She stood, gathering her sketches for the next class. The radio played a song of hope, its melody weaving through the office. David's end and Rachel's betrayal were distant echoes, their weight no match for her strength. The photograph's fragments lay in the bin, a final severing of the past. Emily's cast was gone, her arm healed, her spirit soaring. She thought of her grandmother, whose needles had told stories of resilience. Now, Emily's stitches told hers, and those of countless women she'd inspire. As she locked the office, the sunset painted Guangzhou in gold, mirroring the threads of her gowns. The Hutongs sang of a China in flux, factories privatizing, women rising, dreams taking flight. Emily entered the market, her contract in hand, her heart light. She was no longer the girl who'd died, nor the wife who'd suffered. She was Emily, a beacon in a new era, her legacy woven into every student, every design, every fearless step forward.